The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow. Each sweep cleared maybe half a second of visibility before white curtains reclaimed the glass. Erin Hull gripped the steering wheel of the M1083A1 cargo truck and leaned forward, squinting through the storm like she could rode into existence. The heater rattled against its housing, pushing warm air that barely reached her boots. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 22 Celsius, and the wind chill made it feel closer to minus 35. She had driven this route 43 times in the past 2 months. Supply Run 7, fondly nicknamed Siberia Spine by drivers who had survived it, stretched 18 kilometers from Fire Base Corman through frozen pine forest, across 3 ridge lines, and down into the logistics depot at Camp Halvar. Most runs took 90 minutes. Tonight, with visibility at less than 20 meters, Erin figured she would be lucky to make it in 3 hours. The radio crackled with static. She ignored it. Command had nothing to say to a logistics driver, and logistics drivers had learned not to expect anything from command. Her cargo tonight consisted of 400 liters of diesel fuel in jerry cans, 12 cases of MREs, 6 replacement batteries for the BMP, 2 fighting vehicles stationed at the forward observation posts, and a crate of medical supplies that the field hospital had been requesting for 9 days. Standard load, standard route, standard irrelevance. Erin adjusted her grip on the wheel as the truck lurched through a deep rut hidden beneath the snow. The suspension groaned. She had reported the worn shocks 3 weeks ago. The maintenance request was still sitting in someone's inbox, buried under requisition forms for ammunition and body armor. Things that mattered. She was 26 years old, with the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. Brown hair tied back in a practical knot. Gray eyes that spent more time watching the road than making eye contact with anyone. Hands that had learned to work fast and stay quiet. Before the war, she had been 2 semesters away from finishing her civil engineering degree at the National Technical University. She had specialized in structural load analysis, the mathematics of what holds things up and what makes them fall down. Now she drove trucks. The irony was not lost on her. The snow intensified as she crested the second ridge line. Erin downshifted, feeling the transmission resist before grudgingly engaging. The truck slowed to a crawl. Through the white haze, she could make out the dark shapes of pine trees bending under the weight of accumulated ice. This was the section of the route she hated most. Exposed ridgeline with steep drops on either side and no guardrails because no one had bothered to install them. She was halfway across when she saw it. At first, her brain registered as a shadow, some trick of the storm play with her exhausted eyes. But as she squinted harder, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. Tracks deep, parallel impressions in the snow, cutting across the road at an angle and disappearing into the tree line to her right. Erin stopped the truck. For a long moment, she sat there, engine idling, wipers still fighting their futile war against the storm. Her breath fogged in the cab despite the heater's best efforts. She knew she should keep driving. The protocol was clear. Supply drivers do not stop. Supply drivers do not investigate. Supply drivers deliver their cargo and return to base. But those tracks, they were wrong. She had seen every kind of track this winter. BMP-2s, BTR-80s, the light reconnaissance vehicles that the forward scouts used, even an occasional tank when command decided to reposition armor. She knew the width of each tread pattern, the depth of compression based on vehicle weight, the characteristic marks left by worn tracks versus fresh ones. These were different. Erin reached for her field notebook, a battered thing held together with tape and stubbornness, and stepped out of the cab. The cold hit her like a physical assault. She gasped, pulled her balaclava higher, and forced herself to move toward the tracks. The tread spacing was wider than anything in their inventory. 87 centimeters between outer edges. If she had to estimate, the compression depth suggested something heavy, much heavier than a standard APC. And there, behind the main tracks, she saw the drag marks, parallel grooves running between the tread impressions, consistent with towed equipment, artillery sleds. Erin felt her stomach tighten. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage, and hit that notification bell. Now, let me take you back to what happened next. She crouched in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through her knees, and traced the direction of the tracks with her eyes. They came from the northeast, from the forested highlands where their reconnaissance drones had reported no significant activity, and they headed southwest toward a narrow passage that most commanders had forgotten existed. The Alder Cut. Erin knew that passage. She had studied every topographical feature of this region during her engineering coursework, and she had driven close enough to the Alder Cut to understand its tactical significance. It was a natural corridor, steep walls on either side, dense tree cover overhead, and a single timber bridge spanning a frozen ravine at its narrowest point. The bridge had been built decades ago for logging operations. Its load rating was posted at 12 metric tons. Whatever had made these tracks weighed considerably more than 12 metric tons. Erin climbed back into the truck, her fingers already numb despite the gloves. She grabbed the radio handset and keyed the transmit button. Firebase Corpsman, this is Supply 7. Over. Static. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Supply 7, Corpsman, send traffic. The voice belonged to Corporal Yenin, the night shift communications operator who spent most of his time playing cards with the sentries. Erin had delivered coffee to him twice. He had never learned her name. I'm at grid reference Tango Delta 478. I found tracks. Heavy vehicles, possibly armored, heading southwest toward the Alder Cut. Request permission to report directly to Battalion S2. A pause. She could almost hear Yenin's eyebrows raising. Supply 7, repeat last. You found what? Tracks heavy tracked vehicles with towed artillery. Someone is moving armor through the sector, and they're not using the main roads. Another pause, longer this time. When Yenin came back, his voice carried a particular condescension that rear echelon soldiers reserve for anyone they consider beneath their station. Copy. Supply 7. I'll pass it up. Continue your mission. Corporal, these tracks are fresh. Less than 6 hours old based on snow accumulation. If enemy armor is moving toward the Alder Cut, acknowledged. Supply 7. Continue your mission. Corpsman out. The radio went dead. Erin stared at the handset for a long moment, then carefully placed it back in its cradle. She was not surprised. She had stopped being surprised approximately 3 weeks into her assignment, when she had watched the captain ignore a fuel leak that eventually stranded an entire platoon in hostile territory. The military, she had learned, ran on hierarchy more than competence. She put the truck in gear and continued driving. By the time she reached Camp Halvar, the storm had begun to ease. The depot sprawled across a shallow valley, protected on 3 sides by low hills and connected to the main supply network by a single hardened road. It was never meant to be a combat position, just a waypoint for logistics operations, staffed by quartermaster personnel and an occasional engineering team rotating through for infrastructure repairs. Erin backed her truck into the unloading bay and cut the engine. 2 privates emerged from the supply warehouse, moving with the sluggish reluctance of soldiers who had been warm and did not want to be cold. She climbed down from the cab and began directing them toward the cargo straps. Medical supplies first. They'd been waiting for those. The taller private, a kid named Bodon, who could not have been more than 19, nodded without looking at her. Yeah, we know. Doc Martins has been complaining for a week. Then maybe move faster. He shot her a look that suggested supply drivers should know their place, but he moved faster. Erin used the time to find the depot senior NCO, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, who had been running logistics in this sector for 8 years. She found him in operations hut, hunched over a map table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Sergeant, I need to report something. Kowalski glanced up. His face bore the weary patience of a man who had heard every possible complaint and stopped caring about most of them. Ho, right? Supply 7? Yes, Sergeant. I found tracks on the ridge route. Heavy vehicles, towed artillery, heading toward the Alder Cut. I reported to Firebase Corpsman, but they filed it somewhere between not my problem and I'll get to it never. Kowalski sighed. Yeah, that sounds about right. What kind of tracks? Erin pulled out her notebook and flipped to the page where she had sketched the tread patterns. 87-centimeter spacing, deep compression suggesting 40-plus metric tons per vehicle. Drag marks consistent with towed artillery, probably 152 millimeters howitzers based on the spacing. Kowalski studied the sketch for a moment, then looked at her with slightly more interest than before. You know your tracks. I studied engineering. Load analysis. He turned back the map, tracing a line from the ridge route toward the southwest. Aldercut. That's the old logging corridor, yeah? Bridge over the ravine. Timber construction. Rated for 12 tons. But that was 30 years ago. It's probably degraded to 8 or 9 by now. Definitely not capable of supporting armor vehicles. Then why would anyone try to move armor through there? Because no one thinks they can, Aaron said, which makes it the perfect surprise approach. If they reinforce the bridge somehow, or if they think we won't be watching, they could push a column through and hit the main valley from the flank while everyone's focused on the eastern approaches. Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. I'll pass it up the chain. But I'm going to be honest with you. Whole battalions got their eyes on the main valley. That's where the latest intel says the enemy offensive is coming. Some tracks in the snow aren't going to change their minds. Even if those tracks lead to a 40-ton battering ram heading straight for their blind side, even then, Kowalski's voice was not unkind, but it was final. I'll report it. That's all I can promise. Aaron left the operations hut and walked back to her truck. The privates had finished unloading and were already retreating to the warehouse's warmth. She stood alone in the cold, looking at the sky where the clouds were beginning to thin. She thought about her professors at the university, the ones who had taught her that engineering was about understanding forces, about predicting where stress would accumulate and where structures would fail. She thought about the textbooks filled with equations that described exactly how much weight a bridge could bear before it collapsed. And she thought about what happened when 40 tons of enemy armor tried to cross a bridge rated for 12. The next morning, Aaron found herself in the briefing room at Firebase Corpsman, standing against the back wall while officers discussed the upcoming operation. She was not supposed to be there. Supply drivers did not attend tactical briefings, but she had timed her arrival to coincide with the fuel delivery, and no one had questioned why she was lingering near the door. Major Volkov stood at the front of the room, gesturing at a map projected onto a cracked whiteboard. He was a stocky man with the confident posture of someone who had never been wrong and never intended to start. Intelligence confirms the enemy's main force is positioned here. He tapped the eastern edge of the valley. 3 mechanized battalions, supported by artillery from the heights. They'll push through the central corridor. It's the only approach that can handle their logistics train. Our job is to meet them at the Karsten line and hold until reinforcements arrive from the south. A captain raised his hand. Sir, what about the northern approaches? The terrain analysis shows several secondary corridors that could be used for flanking maneuvers. Volkov shook his head. Northern sector is impassable this time of year. Snow depth exceeds 2 meters in most areas, and the only routes would require bridge crossings that can't support armor. We've got reconnaissance drones covering the main approaches. If anything moves, we'll see it. Aaron felt her jaw tighten. She had submitted her report through Kowalski. She knew it had been forwarded to battalion intelligence. And she knew, watching Volkov's confident dismissal of the northern sector, that no one had bothered to read it. The briefing continued for another 40 minutes, covering troop dispositions, fire support coordination, and evacuation protocols. Aaron absorbed every detail, not because she expected to use it, but because she had learned that information was the only currency that logistics personnel possessed. When the briefing ended and the officers filed out, she approached the intelligence sergeant who had been taking notes. Sergeant Bresnik? He looked up, clearly surprised as a supply driver knew his name. Yes. The report from Camp Halvar, the track analysis from the ridge route, was it reviewed? Bresnik's expression shifted from surprise to something closer to discomfort. It was logged, but the assessment determined that the northern approaches aren't viable for armored movement. The bridge at Aldercut can't support anything heavier than a light reconnaissance vehicle. That's my point. What if they plan to reinforce the bridge? Or what if the bridge isn't their crossing point? What if they're planning to move through when the ravine is frozen solid enough to support armor? The ice isn't thick enough. It's been minus 20 for 3 weeks. The ravine is shallow, maybe 4 meters at the deepest. If they got engineering assets, they could layer ice sheets with packed snow. It's a technique from the Winter War. Private Hole. Bresnik's voice hardened. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're a logistics driver. The intelligence assessment was conducted by qualified analysts using satellite imagery, drone reconnaissance, and signals intelligence. Your track observations have been noted. The determination stands. Aaron held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Understood, Sergeant. She walked out of the briefing room and into the cold morning air. The sun was rising over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the snow. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of vehicles as the battalion prepared for the coming battle. She had done everything she was supposed to do. She had reported her findings. She had raised her concerns. She had been heard, noted, and dismissed. And she knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from understanding forces and structures, that the enemy was coming to the Alder Cut. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of activity. Aaron completed 2 more supply runs, ferrying ammunition and fuel to forward positions. She watched convoys roll east toward the Karsten line, filled with soldiers who believed the battle would be fought in the main valley. She listened to radio chatter about enemy positions, artillery coordinates, and evacuation routes. And she thought about the bridge at Aldercut. She had seen it once, during her second week in the sector, when a wrong turn had taken her down an abandoned logging road. The structure was a relic, massive timber beams spanning a 15-meter ravine, held together by iron bolts that had rusted decades ago. She remembered thinking that it looked beautiful in a weathered way, like something from a different era. She also remembered calculating out of pure habit that a single T-72 tank would collapse it in approximately 4 seconds. But that was the problem. The enemy knew this too. They had engineers, reconnaissance, satellite imagery of their own. They would not attempt to cross a bridge that could not support their weight, not unless they had a solution. Aaron found herself at the depot's maintenance bay, staring at a stack of supplies that had been earmarked for the eastern positions. Fuel cans, ration crates, spare parts. Mundane items that the frontline troops needed to function. Mundane items that the enemy would expect to see moving through the sector. And suddenly she understood. The enemy was not planning to cross the bridge. They were planning to bypass it entirely, using the frozen ravine as their crossing point. But to do that, they needed to be certain that no one would be watching, that all attention would be focused on the main valley. They needed a diversion. And the upcoming battle at the Karsten line was exactly that. The moral dilemma crystallized in Aaron's mind with terrible clarity. She could follow orders, continue her supply runs, and watch from a distance as the enemy flanked the battalion's position and destroyed everything she had spent 2 months supporting. Or she could act, without authorization, without orders, without any guarantee that she was right, and risk everything on her own analysis. She thought about what her professors would say. Engineering was about certainty. You calculated the loads, you analyzed the stresses, you determined the breaking points. You did not guess. You did not gamble. You worked the problem until you knew the answer. But this was not a classroom. This was a war, and the people making decisions did not care about her calculations. Aaron made her choice. She found Staff Sergeant Kowalski in the depot's operations hut, exactly where she had left him the night before. He looked like he had not slept. The coffee cup was new, but the exhaustion in his eyes was older than any single night could explain. Sergeant, I need to requisition a supply convoy. Kowalski looked up slowly. For what? Forward position Delta. She pulled a folded requisition form from her pocket, one she had filled out herself, forging the signature of a lieutenant who was currently 40 kilometers away at the Eastern Front. They're requesting fuel and rations for an extended operation. He studied the form, then studied her. Forward position Delta is 9 kilometers from the Alder Cut. Yes, Sergeant. The Alder Cut that you've been warning everyone about. Yes, Sergeant. A long silence stretched between them. Kowalski was not a stupid man. He had survived 8 years in logistics, which meant he understood the difference between official orders and necessary actions. He also understood that Aaron was asking him to participate in something that could end both their careers. Or worse. How many vehicles? 3. Standard cargo trucks, fully loaded. I'll drive lead. And if someone asks why we're running supplies to a position that hasn't actually requested them, Aaron met his eyes. Then I'll tell them it was my mistake. Paperwork error. You didn't know anything about it. Kowalski laughed, a short, humorless sound. That's not how this works. Ho. If you go down, I go down with you. That's the deal. I know. He stared at her for another long moment, then reached for his radio. Corporal Vasquez, Specialist Chun, report to the operations hut. We've got a supply run. 2 hours later, Aaron led a 3-vehicle convoy out of Camp Halvar. Behind her, Vasquez and Chin followed in their own trucks, both of them confused about the sudden mission, but too disciplined to ask questions. They had been told that forward position Delta needed supplies. That was enough. The route Aaron chose was not the most direct. Instead of taking the main road east, she turned north, following the ridge route she had driven 2 nights before. Vasquez's voice crackled over the radio almost immediately. Supply 7, this is Supply 3. You sure about this route? The weather's getting worse. Confirmed, Supply 3. We're avoiding the main road due to reported ice conditions. This route adds 30 minutes, but it's safer. It was not safer. It was deliberately exposed, visible from the high ground to the northeast, where enemy scouts would be watching. Aaron wanted them to see the convoy. She wanted them to follow it. The tracks she had found 2 nights ago were still partially visible, wind-blown but not completely erased. She followed them in reverse, tracing the path the enemy had taken, until she reached a junction where the logging road split into 2 branches. The left branch continued toward the Alder Cut. The right branch led to forward position Delta. Aaron stopped the convoy. Supply 3, Supply 4, hold here. I'm going to check the road ahead. She climbed out of the truck and walked forward, her boots crunching through the crusted snow. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches heavy with ice. Sound seemed muffled, absorbed by the frozen landscape. She moved carefully, scanning the ground for any sign of recent activity. And there, at the edge of the tree line, she found what she was looking for, fresh footprints. 2 sets, spaced 10 meters apart, leading from the tree line toward the road, and then back again. Scout team. They had been watching the junction, probably for the past 12 hours, waiting to see how supply traffic moved through the sector. Aaron smiled. She walked back to the convoy and keyed her radio. All vehicles, listen up. We're going to unload half our cargo here. Stack the crates in a visible formation near the junction. I want anyone watching from the high ground to see that we're staging supplies in this area. Supply 7, what's the point of that? Forward position Delta is still 9 clicks out. Just do it, Vasquez. I'll explain later. They worked for 40 minutes, stacking crates of rations and fuel cans in a pattern that suggested a planned resupply operation. Aaron made sure to leave fresh tire tracks circling the area, creating the impression that multiple vehicles had been here recently. When they finished, the junction looked exactly like a forward supply point, the kind of staging area that a competent enemy would want to avoid or destroy, which was exactly what Aaron was counting on. The convoy continued toward forward position Delta, arriving just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The position was a small observation post manned by 12 soldiers, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the frozen valley below. Their commanding officer, a first lieutenant named Romanenko, met Aaron at the entrance with confused expression. I didn't request any supplies. Standing order from Camp Halvar, sir. Sergeant Kowalski wanted to make sure forward positions had reserves in case the roads become impassable. Romanenko was too tired to argue. Fine. Stack it with the rest. We'll inventory tomorrow. Aaron supervised the unloading, but her attention was elsewhere. From the observation post's elevated position, she could see the entire northern approach, including the logging road that led to the Alder Cut. The bridge was not visible from here, hidden behind a ridge of dense forest, but she could see the terrain leading to it, and she could see the enemy through the post-observation equipment. A pair of high-powered binoculars mounted on a tripod, Aaron spotted the first signs of movement. Vehicles, not on the road, but parallel to it, moving through the trees where their profiles would be harder to detect from aerial surveillance. She counted 12 distinct shapes before the fading light, made further observation impossible. 12 vehicles. If her analysis was correct, that meant at least 40 enemy soldiers, plus whatever artillery they were towing. A full strike force, moving into position while the battalion focused on the main valley. She found a post-communication specialist, a young corporal with a patchy beard and nervous eyes. I need to send a message to Firebase Corpsman. Priority traffic only. We're under radio discipline until the operation begins. This is priority. Tell them Supply 7 has visual confirmation of enemy armor movement in Sector Tango Delta, heading toward the Alder Cut. At least 12 vehicles, possibly more. Request immediate reconnaissance or fire mission. The corporal hesitated, then keyed his radio. Fire Base Corpsman, this is forward position Delta. We have a priority message from Supply 7. Visual confirmation of... The response came immediately, cutting him off. Delta, this is Corpsman. Be advised, we are tracking significant enemy activity in the main sector. All non-essential traffic is to cease. Maintain observation and report only confirmed hostile contact. Corpsman out. Erin felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprised. She had expected this. But hearing it, having her warning dismissed in real time, made the situation feel inescapable. She had one option left. Corporal, who's the senior observer on duty tonight? Sergeant Tarasov. He's been running the night watch for a month. I need to speak with him. Tarasov was exactly what Erin expected. A weathered NCO in his late 40s with a 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much and stopped caring about the rest. He was cleaning his rifle when she found him, working the bolt with mechanical precision. What do you want, driver? I need you to watch the Alder Cut tonight. Whatever you see, document it. Times, vehicle types, movement patterns, everything. Tarasov looked up. His eyes were flat, unreadable. And why would I do that? Because in approximately 6 hours, the enemy is going to push an armored column through that pass. They're going to bypass the bridge using the frozen ravine, and they're going to hit the battalion's flank while everyone's focused on the main valley. You can either watch it happen or you can help me stop it. A long silence. Tarasov's hand continued working the rifle bolt, but his eyes stayed fixed on Erin. You're that driver, the one who keeps filing reports that nobody reads. Yes. What makes you think you're right and battalion intelligence is wrong? Because I studied engineering. I know how to read terrain, calculate load capacities, and predict structural failures. The enemy has been setting this up for weeks, moving assets into position, scouting the approaches, timing their push to coincide with our main operation. It's not a random flanking maneuver. It's a coordinated strike designed to collapse our entire defensive position. Tarasov was quiet for another long moment. Then, slowly, he set down his rifle. I've been watching that sector for 3 weeks. Every night, I see movement in the trees. Lights sometimes. Engine noise when the wind is right. I reported it 4 times. No one listens. They'll listen when the enemy comes through. By then it'll be too late. Maybe not. Erin leaned forward. The supply point I set up at the junction, it's a trap. If the enemy scouts report it, their commanders will have to decide whether to avoid the area or hit it before they push through the Alder Cut. Either way, it buys us time. Time for what? Time for me to reach the engineers at Camp Baranoff. They've got a reserve QRF and demolition assets. If I can convince them that the threat is real, you won't. Tarasov's voice was flat. I've tried talking to Baranoff. They're worse than Corpsman. Their whole focus is the Eastern Front. They're not going to divert resources based on a supply driver's hunch. Erin felt her plan crumbling. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that if she could just find someone with authority who would listen, the system would respond. But the system was not designed for input from the bottom. It was designed to flow downward from command to execution, with no feedback mechanism for those who could see what command could not. She closed her eyes and forced herself to think. The bridge at Alder Cut, timber construction, load rating of 12 tons, probably less after 30 years of weathering. The enemy planned to bypass it using the frozen ravine, but that would only work if the ice was thick enough to support their armor. If the ravine was not crossable, they would have to use the bridge. And if the bridge was not crossable either, Sergeant, the bridge, what's the fastest way to reach it from here? Tarasov frowned. There's a trail that leads down from the eastern ridge. About 6 kilometers, mostly through forest. Why? Because I'm going to destroy it. The cold had teeth. Erin felt them sinking into her exposed skin as she moved through the forest, following the trail that Tarasov had marked on her map. The night vision goggles she had borrowed from forward position Delta turned the world into shades of green, transforming trees into ghostly pillars and snow into a luminescent carpet that seemed to glow from within. She carried everything she thought she would need, For blocks of C, for plastic explosive from the demolition supplies at the observation post, 2 detonators, 200 meters of deck cord, and a small toolkit that she had assembled from spare parts over the past month. The weight sat heavy on her back, but she moved steadily, pacing herself for the long approach. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness, Tarasov was watching. He had refused to let her go alone, but he had also refused to leave the observation post unmanned. Their compromise was an uneasy one. He would maintain visual contact with the trail as long as possible, using the post's high-powered optics, and he would radio warning if he spotted enemy movement. The radio on Erin's hip had been silent for 47 minutes. She reached the ridgeline overlooking the alder cut at 0134 hours. The bridge materialized out of the darkness below her, its massive timber beam spanning the ravine like the ribcage of some ancient beast. From this angle, she could see the structural details she had only imagined before, the iron bolts securing each beam, the support pillars driven into the frozen earth on either bank, the cross bracing that distributed load across the entire structure. It was elegant in its way, built by engineers who understood that we could flex where steel would shatter, that natural materials could outlast manufactured ones in harsh climates. They had designed the bridge to survive winters that would crack concrete and warp metal. They had not designed it to survive C4. Erin descended the ridge, moving carefully to avoid leaving obvious tracks in the snow. The enemy scouts would be watching. They were always watching. She needed to reach the bridge, set her charges, and withdraw before anyone realized she was there. The ravine floor came into view as she approached the bridge's eastern abutment. She paused, pressing herself against a thick pine trunk, and scanned the area through her goggles. Nothing moved. The only sound was the wind pushing through the treetops and the occasional crack of ice settling in the frozen stream bed below. She moved forward. The first support pillar rose from the earth like a monument, 3 meters of weather-blackened timber sunk deep into the frozen ground. Erin crouched beside it and ran her hands over the surface, feeling for the structural seams. Years of engineering study guided her touch. She knew where the stress would concentrate, where a single fracture would propagate through the entire structure. She placed the first charge. The C, molded easily in her gloved hands, pressing into the seam between the primary pillar and its diagonal brace. She inserted the detonator with careful precision, then unspooled deck cord toward the second pillar on the opposite side of the ravine. She was halfway across the frozen stream bed when her radio crackled. Supplies 7, this is observation. Movement on your 6. 3 tangos, approximately 400 meters, and closing. Get out now. Erin froze. Her breath came fast, fogging the cold air. She was exposed on the ravine floor, visible from almost every angle. If the enemy spotted her, there would be no escape. She made a decision. Instead of retreating, she ran forward, covering the remaining distance to the second pillar in a stumbling sprint. Her boots slipped on the ice. She fell, caught herself, pushed up again. Behind her, she could hear nothing. The wind masked any sound pursuit, but she knew they were coming. The second pillar loomed before her. She did not have time for precision. She slapped the remaining C4 against the base, jammed the second detonator into the explosive, and connected the deck cord with fumbling fingers. Then she ran. The eastern bank of the ravine rose steeply, a scramble of frozen earth and exposed roots. Erin clawed her way up, her lungs burning, her legs screaming with exertion. She could feel the deck cord trailing behind her, unspooling from its reel as she climbed. She reached the tree line just as the first shots rang out. The crack of automatic fire split the night, impossibly loud in the frozen stillness. Erin threw herself behind a thick pine, her hand still clutching the detonator control. Bullets tore into the trees around her, sending splinters of bark flying through the air. She keyed her radio. Observation, I'm under fire. Multiple shooters. I need covering fire or a diversion. Supplies 7, we can see them. 3 hostiles on the western bank, moving toward your position. We don't have a shot. Too much tree cover. You need to move. Erin looked down at the detonator in her hand. The charges were set. The bridge was rigged to collapse. All she had to do was press the button. But if she detonated now, with enemy soldiers just meters from the structure, they would know. They would understand that the bridge had been deliberately destroyed. They would report back, and their commanders would reroute the entire column, probably finding another crossing point that Erin had not prepared for. She needed them to try using the bridge first. Observation. Can you reach Firebase Corpsman? Tell them the bridge is rigged. When the enemy column arrives, we need someone with authority to give the detonation order. That could be hours from now. What are you going to do until then? Erin pressed her back against the tree, listening to the gunfire fade as the enemy soldiers lost her in the darkness. Her options were limited. She could not reach the observation post without crossing open ground. She could not return to Camp Halvar without abandoning the detonator. And she could not stay here indefinitely. Eventually, the enemy would find her, but she did not need to do any of those things. She needed to wait. And she needed to make sure that when the enemy column arrived, they believed the bridge was still intact. Erin began to move, circling through the forest toward a position that would give her eyes on both the bridge and the approach road. The enemy scouts had seen her. They knew someone had been at the bridge, but they did not know who or why. If she was lucky, they would assume it was a routine patrol that had stumbled into their perimeter. If she was lucky, dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through the cloud cover like water through a cracked dam. Erin had not slept. She had spent the night in a shallow depression beneath a fallen tree, wrapped in an emergency thermal blanket from her supply pack, watching the bridge through her binoculars. The enemy scouts had searched the area for nearly 2 hours after the shooting stopped, but they had not found her position. She had listened to them calling to each other in voices distorted by distance and wind, heard their footsteps crunching through the snow, felt her heart hammering each time they passed within 50 meters of her hiding place. They had given up around 0400, withdrawing to the western tree line to wait for their main force. Now, as the sun rose behind the clouds, Erin could see the first signs of the column's approach. Dust, or what passed for dust in this frozen landscape, rising from the road beyond the ridge. Engine noise, growing steadily louder. The grinding of metal treads on frozen earth. She keyed her radio. Observation. This is Supply 7. I have visual on the enemy column. They're approximately 2 kilometers from a bridge and advancing. Tarasol's voice came back, tight with tension. Acknowledged. Supply 7. I passed 3 reports to Firebase Corpsman. No response. They're fully engaged with the main operation in the Eastern Valley. What about Camp Baranov? The QRF. Baranov says they can't divert without authorization from Battalion. Battalion says the northern sector is not a priority. Erin felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She had known this would happen. She had known, from the moment she first saw those tracks in the snow, that the system would not save them. The system was designed for large-scale operations with clear hierarchies and centralized command. It was not designed for a supply driver with a bag of explosives and a conviction that everyone above her was wrong. She looked at the detonator in her hand. The column was closer now. She could make out individual vehicles through her binoculars. T-72 tanks, their broad turrets distinctive even at this distance. BMP, 2 infantry fighting vehicles. And behind them, just as she predicted, the towed artillery, 2 S-3 Akatsiya self-propelled howitzers, their 152 millimeters guns elevated for transport. 12 vehicles at least. Maybe more. Enough firepower to shatter the battalion's flank and roll up the entire defensive line. She thought about the soldiers at the Karsten line, focused on the enemy in front of them while death approached from behind. She thought about Kowalski, sitting in his operations hut with his cold coffee, probably wondering if she was still alive. She thought about the professors who had taught her to solve problems, to analyze forces, to understand the mathematics of structures that stood and structures that fell. And she made her choice. Observation. This is Supply 7. I'm going to initiate detonation as soon as the lead elements reach the bridge. There's no time to wait for authorization. A pause. Then Tarasol's voice, quieter than before, understood. Supply 7, good luck. Erin watched the column approach. The lead tank, a T-72B3 with reactive armor panels bolted to its turret, reached the western edge of the bridge and stopped. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought they had discovered the charges. But then the commander's hatch opened, and a figure emerged, scanning the bridge through binoculars of his own. Structural assessment. They were checking the bridge's condition before committing the column. Erin held her breath. The commander disappeared back into the turret. A moment later, the tank lurched forward, its tracks biting into the wooden planks of the bridge deck. The structure groaned. Erin could hear it even from her position 200 meters away. But it held. 12 tons of tank. The bridge was rated for 12 tons. The tank reached the midpoint. A second vehicle, a BMP-2, began crossing behind it. 28 tons now. The structural margin was gone. A third vehicle started onto the bridge. Erin pressed the detonator. The explosion was not what she expected. In movies, bridge demolitions were spectacular. Fireballs, debris flying in slow motion, dramatic collapses accompanied by orchestral music. In reality, the C4 detonation was a sharp crack, almost anticlimactic, followed by a grinding shriek of tortured wood. The first support pillar disintegrated in a cloud of splinters and frozen earth. A microsecond later, the second charge fired, taking out the matching pillar on the opposite bank. The diagonal braces, suddenly carrying loads they were never designed to support, snapped like twigs, and the bridge fell. The T-72 at the midpoint went first, dropping nose first into the ravine as the deck collapsed beneath it. 40 tons of steel plunging 7 meters onto frozen rocks. The impact sound was deafening, a thunderclap of metal against stone that echoed through the valley. The turret tore free from the hull on impact, rolling down the ice-covered stream bed like a discarded toy. The BMP, two behind it, tried to reverse, but the deck was already collapsing faster than the driver could react. The vehicle's rear treads found empty air, and it tipped backward into void, landing on its back with a crash that sent a plume of debris skyward. The third vehicle, another BMP-2, managed to slam into reverse just in time, its front treads hanging over the ragged edge of the shattered deck. For a moment it teetered, perfectly balanced between survival and oblivion. Then the remaining planks gave way, and it slid forward into the ravine with a grinding screech. 3 vehicles destroyed. The rest of the column, 9 vehicles still on the western bank, ground to a halt, their advance stopped cold by the sudden absence of a road. Erin watched through her binoculars, her heart pounding so hard she could feel in her throat. She had done it. She had actually done it. The bridge was gone. The column was trapped, and the enemy's flanking maneuver had failed before it could begin. But she was not finished. The enemy's soldiers were recovering from the shock. Hatches were opening, commanders emerging to assess the damage. In minutes, they would begin reorganizing, looking for alternate crossing points, calling in artillery support, or simply turning their guns toward whatever threat had destroyed their bridge. Erin needed to disappear. She started moving, crawling backward through the depression beneath the fallen tree, keeping her profile low. The thermal blanket went back into her pack. The detonator, now useless, she buried in the snow. Her tracks would be visible, but the forest was thick enough to provide cover if she moved fast. She had traveled maybe 50 meters when the first shell landed. The 2S-3 howitzer at the rear of the column had turned its gun toward the ridgeline where she had been positioned. The 152 millimeters round hit the forest floor with concussive blast that knocked Erin flat, showering her with frozen dirt and shattered branches. Her ears rang. The world tilted sideways, then slowly stabilized. More shells followed. The enemy was walking fire across the ridge, saturating the area with high explosives. Erin pressed herself into the snow and crawled, moving by pure instinct, driven forward by the primal need to be somewhere else. The bombardment lasted 3 minutes. When it stopped, Erin lay still, listening to the settling debris and the distant rumble of engines. Her radio was dead, probably damaged by the concussion. Her left arm throbbed where a chunk of wood had struck it, but she was alive. She forced herself to her feet and kept moving. The forest seemed endless now, a maze of identical trees and snow-covered ground that blurred together in her exhausted vision. She navigated by compass, heading southeast toward forward position Delta, hoping that Tarasov had seen enough to convince someone that her actions had been necessary. She was still 2 kilometers from the observation post when she heard the helicopters. To me, 24 Hinds burst over the ridgeline, their rotors thundering through the cold air. Erin threw herself behind a tree, but the helicopters were not looking for her. They were heading northeast, toward the Alder Cut, toward the trapped enemy column. For a long moment, she did not understand. Their forces did not have Me-24s. The battalion's aviation assets were committed to the Eastern Valley. There should not be any friendly aircraft in this sector. Then she heard the radio crackle. Supply 7. This is Firebase Corpsman. Do you copy? Sergeant Kowalski reached Camp Baranoff with your intelligence. QRF is inbound to your position. Repeat, QRF is inbound. Acknowledge. Erin fumbled for her radio, found the power switch, toggled it several times. Nothing. The unit was dead, but it did not matter. She watched the helicopters descend toward the ravine, their weapon systems lighting up the trap column with rockets and cannon fire. Secondary explosions bloomed as ammunition cooked off inside the disabled vehicles. Black smoke rose into the gray sky, marking the end of the enemy's flanking force. Kowalski had gotten through. Against all odds, against the system, against the institutional inertia that had dismissed her warnings at every turn. Someone had finally listened. Erin sank to her knees in the snow and began to laugh. It was not a happy sound, more like the release of tension that had been building for days, finally finding an outlet. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She laughed until her chest ached and tears froze on her cheeks. Then she stood up and started walking again. Forward position Delta was chaos when Erin arrived. Soldiers ran between positions. Radios crackled with overlapping transmissions, and a medical evacuation helicopter was just lifting off in the improvised landing zone. Tarasov met her at the perimeter, his weathered face showing something that might have been relief. You look like hell, driver. I feel like hell. Erin accepted the canteen he offered and drank deeply. The water was cold enough to hurt her teeth. What happened? Exactly what you said would happen. Tarasov led her toward the command post. After you went dark, I kept reporting what I saw. Corpsman ignored me, but I managed to reach Kowalski at Camp Halvar. He pulled some strings, threatened to file a formal insubordination complaint against the intelligence officer who dismissed your reports. That got attention. Kowalski did that. Apparently, he's been sitting on a file of ignored intelligence recommendations for the past 3 years. He told Battalion that if they didn't respond to the Aldercut threat, he would forward the entire file to the Inspector General. Command hates bad press more than they hate being wrong. Erin shook her head slowly. So they sent the QRF, 2 helicopter gunships and a quick reaction platoon. They hit the enemy column while it was still trying to reorganize after you blew the bridge. Destroyed 9 vehicles, killed or captured approximately 40 enemy soldiers. The survivors retreated northeast. There's a reconnaissance drone tracking them now. The command post was a cramped bunker dug into the rocky hillside, its walls lined with radio equipment and tactical maps. Lieutenant Romanenko stood at the center table, speaking rapidly into a handset. When he saw Erin, his eyes widened. Private Hull, I've been trying to reach you for the past 2 hours. My radio was damaged, sir. Romanenko set down the handset and walked toward her. His expression was difficult to read, some combination of anger, confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect. Sergeant Kowalski informed me that you conducted an unauthorized demolition operation against the enemy's crossing point. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. Without orders from any superior officer? Yes, sir. Using explosives requisitioned under false pretenses? Erin hesitated. Yes, sir. Romanenko was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, the radio continued to crackle with reports from the Eastern Valley, where the main battle was still raging. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. Battalion intelligence has reviewed the reconnaissance footage from the Alder Cut. They've confirmed that the enemy column included elements of 2 mechanized infantry battalions, supported by self-propelled artillery. If they had reached the main valley, they would have caught our forces in a crossfire that we could not have survived. I know, sir. You understand that you violated at least 7 different regulations, including unauthorized requisition of military assets, falsification of official documents, and operating outside your designated role without orders? Yes, sir. Romanenko nodded slowly. Good, because when you're brought up for disciplinary review, I want you to understand exactly what you did wrong. He paused. I also want you to understand that I'm going to recommend the review be postponed indefinitely due to operational considerations. Erin blinked. Sir, the battalion just survived what could have been a catastrophic flanking attack. The enemy's offensive in the main valley is collapsing because their support elements never arrived. Right now, Command is too busy celebrating victory. They didn't earn to worry about how it happened. If anyone asks, I'll tell them that forward position Delta conducted the operation under my orders. Lieutenant, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything. Private, I'm choosing to cover for you because you were right and everyone else was wrong. That doesn't happen often in this army, and when it does, it deserves to be protected. Romanenko smiled, a thin expression that carried no warmth. Besides, if battalion realizes a supply driver saved the entire sector while their intelligence officers were playing cards, there will be hell to pay. It's better for everyone if this gets buried. Erin did not know what to say. She had expected punishment, court-martial maybe, or at least demotion and transfer. She had not expected protection. Tarasov, still standing by the door, cleared his throat. Lieutenant, there's one more thing. Camp Baranov is sending a representative to debrief the operation. They want to know how we identified the enemy movement before their reconnaissance assets did. Tell them it was a combination of signals intelligence and forward observation. Romanenko glanced at Erin. Private Ho had nothing to do with it. The next 6 hours passed in a blur. Erin was given food, clean water, and a cot in the depot's overflow quarters. She slept for 3 hours, deep, dreamless sleep that her body had been demanding for days, and woke to find the sky growing dark again. The battle in the Eastern Valley was over. The enemy, deprived of their flanking force, had withdrawn under pressure from concentrated artillery and air strikes. Casualty reports were still coming in, but the initial estimates suggested that the battalion had survived with far fewer losses than anyone had predicted. Erin walked to the depot's main gate and looked out over the frozen landscape. Somewhere to the north, the alder cut was still smoldering, black smoke rising from the wrecked vehicles, carried west by the wind. The bridge she had destroyed would eventually be rebuilt, probably stronger than before. The ravine would remain, a natural barrier that no amount of engineering could erase. She thought about her professors again, about the equations they had taught her and the principles she had learned. Structures failed when forces exceeded tolerances. Systems collapsed when stress concentrated in unexpected places. The mathematics were always the same, whether you were analyzing a bridge or an army. And sometimes, Erin realized, the only way to save something was to break something else first. 3 weeks later, Erin stood in the operations hut at Firebase Corpsman, watching snow fall through the window. The storm had returned, as storms always did in this part of the world, blanketing the landscape in fresh white that covered old tracks and buried old memories. Staff Sergeant Kowalski sat at his usual position, coffee cup in hand, but something had changed. The exhaustion was still there, written in the lines around his eyes and the gray streaks in his hair, but there was something else too. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. Battalion S, 2 requested your complete intelligence summary, he said, sliding a folder across the table. They're calling it a model of forward-deployed analytical capability. Apparently, they want to study your methodology. Erin picked up the folder and thumbed through its contents. Her original sketches of the track patterns, her estimates of vehicle weight and speed, her calculations about the bridge's load capacity and the ice thickness in the ravine. All of it neatly organized and officially stamped. They put my name on this? Not exactly. They put Forward Position Delta's name on it, with a footnote crediting Organic Intelligence Collection by Logistics Personnel. Kowalski smiled, which is military speak for a supply driver figure out what our satellite reconnaissance miss. Erin set the folder down. What happens now? Now, you go back to driving trucks. The war's not over, and we still need fuel and rations at the front. Kowalski paused. But there's been some talk about establishing a reconnaissance liaison position at Camp Halvar. Someone who can bridge the gap between what the drivers see and what command needs to know. It's not official yet, but your name has been mentioned. She thought about that. A new position. A chance to use her skills in a way that mattered. It was more than she had expected, more than she had dared to hope for. And the disciplinary review? What disciplinary review? Kowalski's expression was carefully blank. There's no record of any unauthorized operations in this sector. Lieutenant Romanenko's report confirms that all actions were conducted under proper authority. As far as battalion is concerned, the Alder Cut operation was a textbook example of forward initiative. Erin nodded slowly. The system, she understood, had its own way of burying inconvenient truths. Sometimes it worked against you, like when intelligence reports were ignored and warnings were dismissed. But sometimes, just sometimes, it worked in your favor. She walked out of the operations hut and into the falling snow. The cold wrapped around her like an old familiar presence, sharp enough to sting, but no longer threatening. She had survived worse cold than this. She had survived worse things than cold. The supply truck was waiting where she had left it, engine running to keep the battery warm. The cargo for today's run was already loaded: diesel, rations, medical supplies. The same mundane essentials that kept the front line functioning. The same mission she had performed 43 times before. But something was different now. She was different. Erin climbed into the cab and adjusted her grip on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, she could see the road stretching north toward the ridgeline, toward the junction where she had staged her trap, toward the cut where a bridge no longer stood. She thought about the enemy's soldiers she had killed. Not many, probably maybe 10 or 15 in the vehicles that had gone into the ravine. But the soldiers who had been killed at the flanking attack had succeeded, numbered in the hundreds. Her calculations had saved more lives than they had taken. The mathematics balanced. The equation resolved. She put the truck in gear and started driving. The windshield wipers fought their familiar battle against the snow. The heater rattled in its housing, pushing warm air that still did not quite reach her boots. The radio crackled with static, quiet now that the immediate crisis had passed, but ready to carry new warnings if they came. And Erin Hull, quiet logistics driver, former engineering student, and the woman who had wiped out an enemy armored column by understanding how bridges fall, watched the road ahead with clear gray eyes. No one saluted her when she passed through the checkpoints. No one mentioned the Alder Cut or the burning vehicles or the thundering helicopters that had finished what she started. To everyone she encountered, she was just another supply driver running another supply loop through another blizzard. That was fine with her. Erin had never needed medals or recognition. She had needed to be right, and she had been. She had needed to act when action was required, and she had. She had needed to trust her own judgment when everyone above her failed to do the same. And the next time she saw tracks in snow, wide tread spacing, deep compression, the telltale marks of forces moving where they were not supposed to be, she would do it all over again. The truck crested the ridgeline, and for a moment, before the road descended back into forest, Erin could see the entire northern sector spread out below her. Snow-covered hills, dark clusters of pine, the distant smoke that still marked the Alder Cut. It looked peaceful from here. It looked like nothing had ever happened. But she knew better. She always would. The road curved downward, and the vista disappeared behind the trees. Erin settled back in her seat, adjusted the heater vent, and continued driving. There were supplies to deliver. There was a war to win. And somewhere out there, hidden by the snow and the forest and the endless frozen landscape, there were always enemies who thought they could move undetected. They were wrong. Erin knew how to watch, and Erin knew how to act. The truck's engine rumbled steadily as it descended toward the depot, carrying its mundane cargo through the storm. Behind it, the tracks it left in the snow would fill within hours, erased by wind and weather as if they had never existed. But the enemy column at the Alder Cut, those tracks had been different. Those tracks had told a story, and Erin Hull had been the only one willing to read it.